Hello, welcome to my two-part series divided into Unix basics as well as high processing clustering systems. First, we're going to start in my first series, the Unix basics. This is by me, Nima Shirni, for Dr. Ding's lab here at UCI. Now let's get into it. So why are we going to be starting with Unix? Well, the reason we're starting with Unix is because the high processing clustering system that we're going to be using is going to operate on what we call a Linux environment. And when we want to understand a system, we have to break it down into its framework. The framework for our clustering system is the Linux environment operating system. And so, first and foremost, we want to understand how the Unix language actually works, because this is a language in and of itself. So if you were to simply just go into the high processing clustering system, you would be met with an entirely different language, and it would be completely foreign to you. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to understand the basics of what we would call bash shell and file editing, which I will be going into shortly. So what is the Unix shell? The Unix shell is a command line interface. A command line interface is essentially different from what we all colloquially know as a graphical user interface. What's a graphical user interface? Well, let's look at our computer. This is a graphical user interface. It's showing me graphics. I'm the user, and I'm interfacing with this graphics. So essentially, with this, all I would have to do is I'm presented with a bunch of options. I can click around. I can move stuff using my mouse. I can right-click to delete things, to edit things. Well, this is going to be completely different from a command line interface, because if you wanted to run programs, create, delete files, navigate through your folders, you're actually going to have to use a command. You're not going to simply be presented with a bunch of options that are rather easy to access. In this, you actually have to learn a whole entire different language to actually be able to allow yourself to do what you would do on a graphical user interface, but to do it on a command line interface. Now, what's the perks of the command line interface? Because it does sound rather cumbersome to use. Well, the whole idea of this is when you use a graphical user interface, everything is being done manually. If you're running a program on a graphical user interface, you're constantly having to run it. You're constantly having to go around clicking in folders. Well, what's the benefit of using a command line interface? It does all of that, but it does it automated. You are now not limited to manual work, but you can do jobs using automation. So this is the reason why we want to learn the Unix shell and why we want to learn a command line interface, because it will allow us to do things automated, which is the whole idea of our high processing clustering system. So in our specific purposes, the shell we're going to use is called bash, which is honestly the most popular shell, and it is used in biotech and bioinformatics and in tech in general. This is essentially denoted as the Born Again shell. This is essentially derived from a shell that was written by Stefan Born. So be ready to learn a new vocabulary, as shell is a language of its own, in which the command line interface-based operations do not have choices presented to you, as I have showed you with a graphical user interface. So first and foremost, how do we get onto Linux? Well, you can download Linux and have it as a secondary operating system, but that can be rather tiresome. We can actually do this on our Windows or on the Mac, but for all intensive purposes, I am currently using a Windows operating system, so I will show you how to do it on Windows. First and foremost, we want to go to the PowerShell. You type in PowerShell here, run it. Go ahead and pause the video and copy and paste this command into the PowerShell prompt. Once it is executed, it will download, take a couple minutes, and then you'll be met with another prompt, a yes or no. It's going to want to restart the computer. You will want to restart the computer, and once you restart it, then we can get things working. First and foremost, the Linux that we're using is a subsystem. You have to remember that the original operating system I'm using currently is Windows, but Windows allows you to also have a subsystem. As we know, the subsystem that we want to use is the operating system Linux. So we can run Linux natively on our Windows PC by using this command line. So once you have done all of that, you're simply going to go to your Microsoft Store. You're going to search up Linux, Ubuntu, either or. Once you search it up, you simply just download it. Once you've downloaded it, you're going to launch it. When it's launched, it's going to prompt you to create a user and password, because essentially you're now on a Linux operating system. So it's not your Windows account anymore. It's actually going to be now your Linux. And it's going to be at the desktop we're using right here. So now once you've done all that, now you can use Bash, what we're mainly interested in. Now you can actually do some shell programming. So now we can open our command prompt. So notice how the prompt here is the prompt for shell. The prompt is going to be a $sign, and that's essentially saying I'm waiting for some sort of input. So as you notice here, there's no $sign. That's because we haven't ran bash yet. If we were to type in bash, enter it without doing all of the previous information that I've given you, Windows would just say, what is bash? Well, now that we've downloaded Linux, we now have access to it. And you can see that here by the prompt here. So now let's get into the vocabulary. Let's start learning the language. The basic command that we can first learn is the ls command. ls is known as listing. So if we were to go ahead and type in ls here, it's going to list everything under my directory currently. So this is my username. This is the directory that we're in. So how do you make sure that this is all right? Well, just go to your computer, go to the exact same path. So find your users. Here it is. Let's cross-check. Yep, everything's there. So the next thing now is understanding how we can use ls and the different kinds of things that you can actually add on to ls, which we'll go on with further later. But for now, let's go on to the next command, the next piece of language. This is going to be pwd. Pwd is an input command, which is known as print working directory. So by inputting this command, it's going to let me know what directory I'm currently working under, which is, of course, the directory that I was expecting, which is my username. So next, why is it important that we know this command? Because when we input commands, we want to first check what directory we're in, so we know that we are in the proper directory before we go forward with our command. And as you can see here in these images, I'm actually showing it to you in the high processing cluster system that's used. So now I can show you an example of why you need to know this. So next is the home directory, or as we call the root directory. The root directory is essentially the folder in which everything is contained. But I'm going to let you know of a difference here because I'm using a subsystem rather than actually working on the operating system, natively. If I go ahead and change my directory to my original directory, type in print working directory, it shows my home. But this isn't my username on Windows. This is my username on my subsystem on Linux. So essentially, the root here is not going to be the same as it would be if I were to go ahead and use Linux. It doesn't connect to my actual root folder in Windows. So that's a quick thing that you need to understand if you're going to be using the subsystem as I am. If you're not using the subsystem and you're actually using Linux, then of course something like this on Linux would be your root folder. But it isn't for me because I'm working on a different operating system. So I can simply go back to where I was, and I will teach you this command later. And simply go back to where I was, and now we're where I was originally. So that's a quick distinction that you should know, especially if you're doing it how I'm doing it. So as we talked about, the slash indicates your root directory. So essentially, as you can see here, this is your root, the beginning of everything, and all the files that follow it are under your root folder. But since I'm using a subsystem, that's different for me. So let's get into a bit more with what you can do with ls as a command and how you can add on things to this command to make it more comprehensive. So let's just look at listing as it is. Here's our listing. Now let's add -f. You're going to start to notice something here. Right, the symbols. You're correct. The symbols here allow you to actually know what these files are. So if it has a trailing slash, that is a directory. If it has an @ symbol, that's a link. If it has an asterisk or star, that indicates an executable program. So by adding just one more command to our ls, now we have a more comprehensive outlook. So you're not too sure how the command works, and you're a bit more interested on the different things you can do with the command. Well, you can actually go ahead and look at some documentation. So you can do ls -- help, or a bit more comprehensive in my opinion would be manual ls, which gives you a huge list of everything that can be combined with ls. Of course, we're not going to go through all this now, but there's just an example if you wanted to know how to do a lot more. And you would scroll with your up and down key, and then quit with Q, as you can see, or you can press H for help, and it'll tell you how to go ahead and scroll through this a little bit easily. So let's go back to our shell. So let's go next into some extra commands that you can tag to our listing command. So there's listing -l. I'll just show you what it does here. So first, let me just show you ls, and now let me show you ls -l. So now you can see that there's a lot more information here. The key thing here is it's going to show you the folder or the program or whatever, and then it's going to tell you the date it was last modified as well as the file size. So that's how you can be even more comprehensive. So with listing, you can be as comprehensive as you want with listing. If there's more information you want, you simply tag the command to it. Now, what about if we want to make this even easier to read? We can add the H option, which means human readable. So what this is going to do, as you can notice, see how these are just simply numbers? Now these numbers are going to be abbreviated into thousands, into a million, and so forth, making it a bit more readable for the user. Another thing we can do is we can use ls -t. Well, let's call it dash, ls-t. ls-t is essentially going to show you the items, instead of being alphabetical, it's going to show you by the last time of the last change to that file or that folder. Another thing we can do is ls-r. This just shows you the contents in a reverse order in the directory. So here are some extra commands that you can use with ls. Next is a very important command. This command is known as changing directories. So rather than having to type out everything, you can simply prompt change directory in the command line to go to another folder. So first, we gotta know which folder we're going. And of course, we know that we are currently in my username folder. So let's look at what's in the folder. So let's say I wanted to go to my desktop. CD desktop. Now, right? I'm in my desktop. And now I've essentially gone from one folder into an entirely another folder. Now, to give you a little easy example of how to understand this, to make it a bit more intuitive for you, think about you're on your desktop and you are double-clicking a folder to access the file in your desktop. It's essentially the same thing. So notice that we're in the same path, and now I want to get to my desktop. It's the same idea, but on the command line. So there's essentially, it's very similar to the graphical user interface, just with a different language, as you can see. So that's the changing directory. And of course, we can keep further changing. So now I have everything on my desktop. Let's say I want to go somewhere else. Bam, I'm in another folder. Get it out. Now I know I'm in that folder for sure. So the next is the special commands in your changing directory folder. Well, this changing directory command only allowed us to go forward in our directory, but how do we go back a step? Well, now we have cd ... which allows just that. So as you can see, I'm in my shell lesson data folder on my desktop, which is right here. Now let's say I just want to go back to the desktop in general. Now I'm back to desktop. Let's say I want to get out of desktop and go back. Now I'm back to my username. That's as simple as it is. And now let's say I need to go back. Now I already know my desktop's there. I already know this folder's there. Bang. So the next thing we can talk about now is a special directory. Now, the special directory is essentially going to show us, let me type it out for you. So to get into the special directory, we're going to want to do -A, or you can simply just tag A on to capital F. And what this means is show all. So it shows absolutely everything. It shows us our dot. The dot means that we're currently in this folder. If we just type in cd dot, we're still in the same folder. Now if we type in cd dot dot, it takes us back to our original folder, which was desktop. So to end things here, we're going to show what I like to call tab skipping. So let's say I want to go into, I know I have shell lesson data on my computer. Let's type in shell cd sh tab, and it completes it. So the tab skipping is just a lot easier for access and accessibility. Let's say I want to go into another folder, tab skip, let's say, and yep, that's pretty much it. So that's just a very basic introduction onto a couple of commands and how to actually scroll through your files. Next, we're going to get more in depth into some other things. But for now, this will be the first video, and thank you for watching.